question mark, I read an article about just this, and the short of it is, I'll tell you the long of it later, but the short of it was that they found, after focusing on these students in a particular high school, that without the language of making a more complex sentence by comparing, or even though, sometimes, in other words, at the same time, without the language, the students couldn't perform the mental task that
Right.
the language asks for. And so once they learned how to use those words, even though they could hold two thoughts in their head at the same time and start comparing things. And so it was kind of cool that the language had to come first before the skill.
Are you speaking about the writing revolution from The Atlantic? That's the article that I just read that was talking about.
Hey, Karen, you sent it around.
Oh, yeah.
It's an excellent article.
We were circulating that. I did, maybe. I think I did.
It's talking about kids on Staten Island. There was and they were basically saying that children in the high school were underperforming, particularly in writing. And at first they thought, well, it must be that they can't read well, because reading is the foundational skill. And in most cases, that's true. Like if your student's not a wide reader, they're not a voracious reader, they're not going to acquire that kind of academic discourse, definitely. But when they started to do explicit instruction in specifically sentences with dependent clauses, if, then the students were able to make these more complicated writing tasks successful, and they definitely saw a bump in their test scores. So.
And the cool thing was, because we always do of Mice and Men,
Mm-hmm.
of Mice and Men prompt in that article was, even though George.
Yeah.
That was the prompt.
Right.
Just so great.
I mean, you see this so often with students where they'll start with if and then they just end the sentence.
Yeah, right.
Where the period, the comma was, and you're just like, oh, that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate, you know, and half the thought is there, right? So anyway, I think dependent clauses too is a they're just saying like this explicit teaching. And Lisa Delpit, who wrote Other People's Children, speaks very specifically to the keys to power. If you want a child to have power and influence in our society, and they're not coming from a home where it's full of books and people are reading newspapers and they're having all these conversations, to not explicitly teach that means that they're going to have to go out on their own and find it. And that feels really unjust. From a social justice standpoint, it just doesn't stand up. You know, so anyway, I can go on and on about that. So the special role of coaches with Common Core, I think you already know this. I'm not saying anything that's news to you. The beauty of the writers' coaches is they clarify students' understanding of their own thinking, of the reading that they can do. And so to the extent that a Socratic dialogue can happen with their coach, where the coach is questioning, and pulling that student out to talk more and more and more. I'm a big talker. I tend to talk at my students and forcing myself to play the role of I always want to have an agenda and get someone to a place, but letting that child be forced to articulate their ideas, even if you have to sit back and watch them stumble, the more questions we can ask and be active listeners, I think that's the road to critical thinking for our students. And I don't know how much the coaches can take on the fact that different students are going to come in with different needs, and one child's going to be struggling at the syntax level. You know, another student might be fairly sophisticated with their syntax, but they need to be pushed on elaborating the nuance. I think that's the messy work. But I think that that's the special role of a coach. And often teachers can't get there because we're reading 75 essays, as you all well know. There's very little time to give that thoughtful dialogue. We write notes. I'm big on typing these notes to my children that they have to then annotate and then they have to check them off. I was big in Google Drive of like commenting on their text, and they'd have to hit resolve. But to be able to have that back and forth is just amazing and precious. And I really, I've been totally amazed by the work that writers coaches have done with my students. Yeah.
You know, this conversation came up the other day in the coaching session with a coach where he had a student who just thought he knew everything and was like, I don't need any help and I don't want to change anything. And this coach, who's a very experienced writer and actually a teacher himself on a college level, was asking me, well, what should I do with a kid like that? And that's what came to my mind is, well, why don't you just ask him some questions like, well, you know, I'm really interested in hearing more about this. What did you actually mean by this statement? Could you tell me more? And that, you know, take it out of the personal realm this is wrong with your writing, you know, it's just more like getting more juice out of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. Yeah.
I site coordinate at Richmond High School,
Mm.
and they have, I forget what they're called, I just gave one to Jane, performance writing task. It's kind of the I think that's what they call it in Oakland, but
Yeah.
the pre-Common Core, and so we worked with some students on one of those. And it's going back to what you just said about whether they're looking at like vocabulary. They had a essay or article that they were reading, and the teacher had done a close reading kind of steps that they were doing with the highlight and then the underline.
Oh, great.
First of all, they highlighted everything. That was very hard for them.
Such a hard skill to teach.
To recognize like what was the most important. They'd
Yeah.
come in and the whole thing would be yellow.
Oh, yes.
But the coaches, some of them really had a hard time because they felt like the kids didn't have a clue and there was nothing we could do to help them bring them up. So I'd love to know how we can talk about, you know, the whole idea of meeting the students where they are and how we can feel like we're helping them, because it feels like an overwhelming task for some students, like they are never going to be able to get there. So what can we say to our coaches in terms of, you know, whatever their need is?
I hear a lot in what you're saying. I would love to hear a little bit more. Was the sense that the students were not understanding what they read, so they couldn't write about it?
Yes, because we were just annotating. We weren't writing yet at all. We were just reading through. I think they had to write one sentence.
Comment or
summary
some.
or something.
Yeah.
There's like a little comment section at the bottom.
Were they doing Cornell notes? Cornell notes, or were they were, so
It was
yeah.
a piece of paper.
Some teachers love to do this thing where they make them read 2 paragraphs and summarize in one sentence. I don't really think that's annotation. I mean, annotation, if the text is interesting enough, they're annotating based on their thinking while they're reading, which is a very different task than summarizing each paragraph, which,
No, it wasn't that.
okay.
It was to read through the whole thing, then read it again, highlight, then talk about who the audience is, and talk about the main point, and talk about, I mean.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. It's like the author, the audience, purpose. There's like 5 things they have to do.
Yes.
Soaps, and I'm not a big fan of that one, but
It
that's
wasn't
also
soap, but
off
anyway,
the camera, please.
So, but regardless
Not
of
a fan
what
of soaps.
regardless of what the teacher was asking,
Yeah.
some of the coaches came to me and said, "Oh, this is so far over their
Heads.
ability level, and they're just gonna fail." And so, how do we take it in little steps and figure out what we can do to help them? Jane looks like she's.
I would love to hear your thoughts
No,
on this,
no,
actually.
I just want to frame this a little bit.
Yes.
We, as an organization, have never really thought of ourselves as coaching reading.
Okay.
And, I mean, we do, you know, because there are a lot of essays that are assigned that have something to do, but we've given so much systematic thought to writing, and we have never given the same kind of systematic thought to reading. And this is why I asked you about this, because
Okay.
I could see this, you know, I can see this coming, that we are going to need to think about this a lot more. We're going to have to give our coaches a lot more direction, and I don't know either.
So now I think I understand a little
Yeah,
bit better
that's
where
right.
you're coming
Yeah.
from. I would say if we go back to the short collaborative reading on page 2, like what that looks like, I think it's totally possible for a coach to be the reading partner. And so they ask the student to read out loud a paragraph, and then they both say, they use a sentence frame for summarizing. So like basically the author was saying that in this paragraph. And then prompting them, well, do you agree or disagree? Did this remind you of something else you'd read? What was your reaction to that? I'm really upset that. I mean, I use those sentence frames in my annotation a lot with my students. I was surprised by her when and just sort of processing the text with them. If that's all you do, I think that's really valuable. If that's where they're at and they're not understanding their reading, they can't do any writing about it yet.
Say more about that, because we're looking at they had a packet that was 10 pages long.
Oof.
And they were supposed to do it in a 1 block period.
Okay.
And it was the 5th day that she'd been working on it with them, and the coaches were like, they're I guess we sometimes feel like we want to help them get to a certain place, and so tell me more about words I can use to say to the coaches that just doing this piece. This is really helpful, actually, on page 2.
Yeah, 2 and 3 together are like a big part of my classroom instruction. I don't have a clean answer for you, Karen, so I'm feeling a little bit like this is a bigger question because it's also about how well did the teacher scaffold, how much time was taken, is the assignment that was given to the writers' coaches to work on within the parameters of a 20-minute conversation. I mean, when you have a coach that's really literally being given at the most, a half an hour to work with a student, they have to be given a task that's doable within a half hour. If it's not doable within a half hour, I think that feedback to the teacher of trying to finish a packet that's 10 pages long means that okay, so just getting clear about, what the teacher wants from that, what the outcome she wants or he wants. I don't have an easy answer. What are other people's thoughts? Because you have as much experience with the writers' coaches and what they're capable of as I do. Yeah.
Well, I think what Jane was saying is really important because what I'm hearing is there is a lot more emphasis on reading, and teaching reading is a very different skill.
Yes.
Than teaching writing, and how kids learn reading is very different based on the kid.
Yeah.
So it leads to more questions for me actually, because what Karen is saying, you can't make this giant leap, you know, and so it is kind of an interesting thing as how we as writer coaches will need to develop some of these skills.
Which is why I think we should be called critical thinking coaches.
I really do too. I really think that's at the heart of what coaches offer.
From the perspective of a coach, I'm not a psych coordinator, I'm not trained to this thing, but from the position of a coach and a writer, part of what I do when I coach kids is ask them questions about their tasks.
Yep.
And ask them questions, or when we're brainstorming, I ask them questions and we develop a story together. And I tell them, when you write, this is what writing is. You ask yourself questions and you answer them. You
Right.
find the answers. You ask more questions and you answer them. So it's not much of a leap from asking questions about your own text to asking questions about somebody else's text. I think what's helpful for a coach is to have a sense of the kinds of questions to ask that you've just given us. Those kinds of questions frame a conversation, and even if we can't meet the teacher's assignment, it's a big assignment. We're coming in, you have 20 minutes. If we know what kinds of questions to ask and try to have that kind of conversation, it's really helpful.
Right. And I do think fiction does require different kinds of questions because I'm also a creative writer, and I think one of the hardest things about creative writing in students is that there's this. For me. And I think this is true with depending on how you teach it, it can be true with argument as well, that you discover what you think as you're writing. And so really assuming that you have, even in a position paper, that you're finding out what you really believe through articulating it, that piece has to be held. And I think sometimes, myself included as a teacher, we fall into this time frame limitation of we're doing the rough draft in 2 hours, and then we're going to do the revision is going to be 2 hours, and then we're going to produce this and it is going to be graded by the end of the quarter. I think that there is that constraint in school, but that's not really how real writing in real life works, right? And so to the extent that we can hold a container for that thought in that mushy space where children have to figure out what they think through conversation with you, through the writing itself, I think it'd be a totally different list of questions for creative writing,
But I think this in terms of any writing.
Yeah.
Even if you're writing about a text, you ask the kinds of questions. What do you think about this? What does this mean to you?
Right.
I mean,
Those are general.
This is just a basic building block of writing. There's questions and there's answers and there's discovery. That's the basic building block.
And that's why coaches are so beautiful, because it's a conversation. Other thoughts? Am I at the end of my slides? Let me check. Yeah, we just talked about that. Great. We're done. It's really nice meeting all of you. Yeah.
Would you be willing to share this electronically?
Sure. I have it all electronically.
And would it be okay if we share it with our coaches?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
that's
You can use it it's all my material, so you can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, if you send it to me, I
Okay.
can get it every
Okay.
now and then.
I'll send you a whole little block of them.
Oh, yeah, this is just terrific.
Great. I hope you guys have a rich conversation in the afternoon.